Hey, welcome back to another episode of Project Fennec. I mean Project Octane. We are in episode 3, and it is obviously not Christmas, but it is my birthday, so I'm in a good mood today. We're gonna rock the party Octane, but joke's on you because we don't really use Rocket League for any of these videos anyways, right? Before I do get into all of the technical garbage that is to follow, there's a couple of things on our check sheet to talk about at the beginning of this episode. So first off, I know last episode I mentioned investing in GameStop. Turns out that might not have been the most sound financial investment for this project, and returns have not been quite as expected. Not to worry though, I think we're going to pursue something a little bit less volatile. I'm looking into the crypto market right now. That might be our next go-to. But enough of that. You all didn't come here to hear me talk about investment strategies all day. Rather, let's talk about the videos we've had so far. So it's come to my attention that maybe this content is a little bit boring. And to that I have to say, it's not me, it's you. Nah, for reals, this is it's definitely me. It seems like most people that start projects like this either already have a project car or an idea of what they're doing already. Whereas I came into this flying by the seat of my pants, nothing in existence to work off of, and just a model from the game. So I do apologize that it's all been very much a conceptual design project so far. But fear not, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a very long tunnel, but there is a light. And hopefully it's in the form of RGB wheels and boost coming out the back of this Octane when it's real. So with all that being said, let's get into today's episode. So last week we were looking at packaging the engine and transmission and looking at a couple of different examples, talking through the pros and cons and sort of ranking them how I felt was most feasible, both mechanically and financially. This week's going to be pretty similar, except now we're going to be looking at the outboard side of things. How the wheel's connected to the chassis, that's going to be our suspension, and then how the wheel's connected to the transmission, which is going to be our drivetrain. But before we dig into that, let's just take a look at our model here and see what Psyonix decided that they were going to use. So when we first take a look at the back of the Octane here, it looks like there's a solid beam axle connecting the two rear wheels. But if you look underneath, it tells a little bit different story. Rather than these two axles being bound together, they're actually connected to the chassis by a pivot point here. And this is referred to as a swing axle. You really have to go to the early days of automotive engineering to see some prototypes where this was used and then eventually phased out for a couple of reasons. So taking a closer look at that swing axle, we've got a pinpoint where that pin goes through the axle. It's just a rough representation. And then we have an estimate for a wheel center out here. The problem with this and why it never really stuck around is because anytime this wheel is excited and is displaced upwards, you have a very sharp change in angle. So even for a relatively small displacement like that shown, you have about 10 degrees of change in the wheel camber, and that's quite excessive. Most production vehicles, it's going to be a matter of a couple degrees to maybe a couple tenths of a degree depending on the application. The other reason why this isn't the greatest design either is because if you have any longitudinal force coming from braking, accelerating, or hitting a bump, all of that load is carried out through that pin that connects the axle to the chassis. The longer the axle is and the closer those two clevises are, the higher your stress is going to be, and without any longitudinal support, you could probably see damage pretty easily. So because there's no real production vehicles that use this, there's nothing that we can snipe to use with our car. So already we have to deviate from this design and look at our options out there. And there's two real options we have to consider. The first is if we want to keep this as an independent suspension, and what I mean by that is that if a single wheel is agitated, only that wheel is affected. the load isn't transferred across to the other wheel. So for that independent suspension, we have two options really. Both are utilizing a wishbone. In one case, you have a McPherson strut on the left, where the strut acts as the upper control arm as well, or you have a double wishbone setup where you have two control arms, and then the strut connects to that lower control arm. This is great for performance, and it's what you're going to see in a lot of racing applications. However, the issue that we run into is that racing cars and production cars have very tightly packaged corners. If you look at a Formula One car or other open wheel race cars, you generally do have longer A-arms that we could use, but in terms of production vehicles that we can look at and purchase, there's nothing that can really span the area that we're looking at in the back end of this. Most of those are right on top of each other, very compact in order to fit with an engine bay in the front of the vehicle. If we really wanted to go that route, we could, but what it means is that we're going to have to make some custom control arms. And while that's not difficult, there's a billion suspension parameters that you have to take into account then, and most likely when you start making new control arms, you probably have to make a new upright, and that whole outer hub is going to become custom, and that's just a lot of time, a lot of money that is going to complicate things. Another con is that visually it doesn't look anything like what you see in the Octane, and the back end of this Octane is very exposed. So ideally, I'd like to try and keep the visual accuracy as close as possible, so that when people are actually taking a close-up look at things, they're not like, hey, it looks nothing like what it does if I look at the rear end in game. So the sort of alternative to this is to using something like that solid beam axle all the way across. And for that, the best option I can think of is a Mustang. While the Mustangs have since switched to an independent rear suspension, I believe it was pre-2015 that they still used a beam axle. So this is what we're looking at. You've got an axle that runs all the way across, connected to your rear differential here. And while it doesn't make a perfect match with what we see in the back of the Octane, it's pretty close. There are a couple extra things going on here on our axle. We've got a set of bump stops, springs going straight up and down, and then our shocks compared to the Octane, where our strut is our shock and spring together. If we strip away the exhaust and everything else in this picture and we look at just the bare axle, this is what we see. Now there's all these brackets and fittings attached to this still, and you can see that they're welded to the axle, but it wouldn't be difficult to grind those off and make new brackets so that this axle would better represent the rear end of the Octane. Performance-wise, it's not nearly as good on the track. What you're doing is you're tying these two axles together, so if one is upset by something, the other one is going to be upset as well. And that's going to affect your grip, your traction that you have. However, this unit by itself, it doesn't really require much design work on my end. It's relatively cheap and easy to find, and it's very easy to work on. But before we can make any sort of decision, we have to see how these two options compare with our engine transmission options. And so I made a little compatibility table here. So on the left, we have our 3 engine transmission options, and then I put a column for both the independent suspension and then the beam axle setup as well. And what we can see is that with the Honda bike engine, it's small enough that we can package it however we want. We can make both options work. For the Subaru Porsche setup, because those designs are dependent on the transmission associated with those vehicles, the front differential, or what's being used as the rear differential, is already built into those transmissions. And so we're not going to be able to use a beam axle with that. That's going to be independent suspension only. And then if we look at our Frankenstein transaxle setup, it's going to be able to use both, but like we said before, that also has another million issues associated with it. So with the transaxle already being that low, this doesn't help it too much by just being open to use either option. If anything, this hurts the Subaru Porsche setup the most, because it makes it dependent on that independent suspension, which is going to require just a ton of time in the end to accomplish. And I'm not ruling that out. I'm just dreading the work that it comes with that. And then you can count another point towards the Honda bike setup because it isn't limited by either of these options. Again, it's the most flexible, and at this point it's starting to separate itself from the other two. So with that being said, I really like the idea of using the Mustang axle, modifying that with different mounts to make things work. So it's not going to look exactly like it does on the Octane here. There's going to be a couple extra links that we'll do our best to hide. But to me, that sounds like a better option than all of the parameters associated with the independent suspension system and all of the tooling and fixturing that it's going to require to make a from scratch custom setup. Before I get too carried away with the beam axle, let's make sure everything looks good first. So I went ahead and put in our engine, assuming it's the bike. And luckily, mounting that longitudinally, it's only 14 inches long. And while I would like to have mounted it transversely and using a chain drive back to an independent rear suspension, it looks like there's a significant amount of space left still. So this isn't nearly as tall as what it actually will be. Positions aren't necessarily right. The only things that we're really looking at here is that we gave it a little bit of space from our firewall. We have the scaled dimension for the length, and then we put in another dimension here, which is supposed to represent the front of the differential. Basically, the distance from this input shaft back to the center line, the wheel center, is what that dimension is. And the reason why we need this is because that axle is sprung. So as the rear wheels move around, that axle is going to jump around. And so there's going to be a CV joint connecting the transmission to the rear axle. And if we're not careful, if those are right on top of each other, a very short drive shaft is going to have a lot of motion in terms of degrees. And that's not going to be good for transfer of power. And we got to make sure that it stays within a certain range. And so what this tells me here, that 5.69 corresponds to roughly 16 or 17 inches, I believe. And so that buys us some space to make sure that we keep that angle on the CV axle as low as possible. So we can check the box that the beam axle is going to work with the bike engine. And we already know from experience that the independent suspension will also work in terms of packaging and space required. The drawback at this point is just the design work associated with it and then the aesthetic look that it provides. The front, though, is a little bit different of a story. We obviously aren't going to have an all-wheel drive system where it's going to be a drive shaft running all the way up to the front. There's not going to be a front differential here. And quite frankly, there aren't any modern production vehicles that fit our dimensions for our track width that use a beam axle up front. But because we aren't providing any power to the front wheels, there's no requirement really to package those additional axles in there. So for this front suspension, I'm very much open to the idea of using an existing platform out there. I checked some rough dimensions, and I think something like an F-150 or Silverado, a regular full-size pickup, the front suspensions on those would actually fit our model pretty well. Again, it's not going to have the same look, but with the front, it's a lot more concealed. And so even though you might notice a little bit of a difference, I think we can work something there that doesn't have to be a complete custom job. We will have to go through and double check some of our mounting points for everything to make sure some of our parameters are in line. You don't want to get in this thing and have a terrible driving experience. So there's still some design work that has to go into verifying those parameters, but it's a heck of a lot simpler using that existing platform. So with that being said, we're mostly concerned about the rear. The front, whatever works, works. The rear was just the main focus because of both needing to drive those wheels as well as manage a suspension system that's going to look good. So to me, that seemed pretty short. It didn't seem like a whole lot got talked about, but I've been dwelling on some of the options, especially with the rear end, for a couple of days now, trying to see what I can find, what measurements lined up. But I think we're at a point where I can put together everything we've talked about so far and sort of do a conceptual design review. And if there's not any major blockades that come out of that, we can move forward with doing the actual design and prototyping of this. So stay tuned. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you next time.